In 1857, a preacher rode into the Kentucky mountains and vanished. Days later, they found his horse, his Bible, but not his body. That was just the beginning. What investigators uncovered in the cellar of a crumbling farmhouse would shock the entire region, and the two people behind it, 20 years old, cousins, smiling as they were led to the gallows. This is the story of Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn, the Appalachian cousins too cold for even history to remember. Some places are born with silence in their bones. Eastern Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, holds a quiet that isn't just about wind in the trees. It's a silence that feels like it's watching. In the mid-1800s, this mountainous region was still wild. Families carved homes into the hillsides. Dirt trails wound through forests older than memory. And some communities were so remote, the law didn't bother visiting. It's here, in this cold and fog-wrapped place, the two cousins, Gideon and Clara, wove a story so dark, so methodically chilling, it's rarely spoken of today. Even the locals who know won't tell it fully, but we will. Because in 1857, something happened on those slopes, something more terrifying than wild animals or winter storms. Travelers started vanishing without trace, and all signs pointed to a stretch of mountain trail between two broken-down homes, separated by just a few miles and a web of secrets. This is not a ghost story. There are no demons, no haunted cabins, but what was found in the cellars and caves of that place haunts the region still, not because of what was supernatural, but because of what was human. This is the story of Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn, how isolation, shared blood, and a thirst for control became a darkness even time has trouble burying.
Gideon Voss was 20 when people in the Highland trails began whispering. Tall and wiry, with the eerie stillness of someone who didn't quite belong in the world, he lived alone in a crooked wooden cabin halfway up Black Hollow Ridge. His father had disappeared years earlier. His mother rarely left the property. Locals said Gideon walked the forest like a ghost, showing up in villages only to sell furs, always at dusk, always gone before morning. Clara Wynn was also 20, his third cousin. Raised on a decaying farm nearly 10 miles away, her life was defined by loss, her parents taken by disease when she was still a teenager. The house became hers, a lonely property choked by weeds and time. She kept to herself. Even her neighbors, the Hutchkins family a few miles down the trail, rarely saw her. People noticed things. Clara's skin never seemed to catch the sun. Her hair was jet black and hung limp, like it had never known joy. When she did speak, it was in a voice so faint folks leaned in without meaning to, and always regretted it. When exactly Clara and Gideon became close, no one knows. In those days, families protected their own, and in the mountains, cousin marriages weren't all that unusual. But what was unusual was how quickly things changed once they started appearing together. In late 1856, traveling merchants began avoiding the Black Ridge trails. Not for bandits, not for bears, for something they couldn't name. A trader named Nathaniel Woods wrote to the sheriff saying 3 of his fellow merchants had vanished on those roads in just a few months. No blood, no wreckage, just missing. It didn't make sense. These were experienced men. Horses came back without riders. Carts were left untouched, with money still inside. It was like the mountains had swallowed the people and spat out everything else. No one wanted to say it aloud, but in the dark corners of taverns, people began to whisper that Gideon and Clara weren't just reclusive. They were dangerous. Sheriff Amos Decker was 52 at the time, a man who'd kept the peace for decades and believed in logic over legends. At first, he talked the disappearances up to nature. The trails were narrow, the cliffs steep, the weather brutal. But even Decker couldn't ignore the pattern. Every person who vanished had passed through the same patch of trail between Gideon's cabin and Clara's farmhouse, and all of them had mentioned plans to seek shelter in that area. He started asking quiet questions. The Hutchins family told him they'd seen smoke from Clara's chimney at odd hours, before sunrise, when no cooking was done. They'd seen figures walking the trail with heavy sacks on their backs, and more than once they saw Gideon and Clara together, wandering in the dark. Then Reverend Elijah Marsh disappeared. He was a preacher from Lexington who believed no home was too remote for a sermon. He told people at the tavern he planned to preach near Black Ridge and would return in a week. He never did. A week later, his horse was found tethered near a stream, with his Bible still rested in the saddle, pages marked by pressed wildflowers. But the man, gone. That's when the fear started to grip the region. Not fear of ghosts, fear of something real and living. Spring rains hit hard Kentucky in 1857. They loosened the soil and flooded streams, and one of those floods did something no sheriff could. It uncovered a clue. A farmer named Thomas Eldridge was checking flood damage when he spotted something shiny in the mud near a creek. It was a silver pocket watch, engraved. He knew it immediately. It belonged to Michael Doherty, a trader who had gone missing the autumn before. The watch was in perfect condition, which meant it hadn't been buried long. Someone had hidden it, and recently. The sheriff called in Milo Crane, a local tracker with decades of experience in the region. Together they followed the creek upward, hoping the water had unearthed more than just one object. What they found, hidden in a crevice behind overgrown brush, was a cave, natural, narrow, and completely undetectable unless you were looking for it. Inside were suitcases, neatly stacked, wallets, clothing still folded, knives, Bibles. 8 travelers, 8 sets of belongings, all catalogued with care. The sheriff didn't need a confession. He needed proof, something that tied this horror to Gideon and Clara. That proof came from Clara's neighbor, a woodcutter named Isaac Drummond. He had camped near Gideon's cabin one night. At 2 a.m., he saw Gideon walk in the forest with a hooded lantern. He followed him to a clearing where Clara was waiting. They spoke quietly, then walked up the trail toward the mountains, carrying something heavy. The sheriff waited, watched, and finally the opportunity came. A merchant named Abel Kincaid planned to travel the trail where others had vanished. Decker asked him to serve as bait under protection from hidden deputies. Kincaid agreed. That evening, Clara stepped from the trees and asked if he'd deliver supplies to her home. She led him inside. The fire was warm, the table clean. She made tea. Then Gideon entered, blocking the door. Kincaid's hand went to his gun, and that's when the sheriff and his men burst through the windows. Clara didn't scream. Gideon didn't fight. They were arrested without resistance. But what they found beneath Clara's barn stunned even the hardest men. A hidden cellar, dug deep, reinforced, with hooks on the ceiling, chains, and more personal items, diaries, rings, letters. This was no robbery. It wasn't desperation. It was a ritual.
In the weeks that followed, Clara and Gideon refused to speak. Not denial, not protest, just silence, as if the arrests were inconvenient, but expected. The trial took place in Cedar Hollow Town Square, under a canvas tent filled with hundreds of people. Some came for justice, others came for spectacle. Prosecutor Samuel Brigham painted a chilling picture. Testimonies from grieving families, maps from Tracker Crane, diaries from the victims, and the most damning piece of all, a shared notebook found under a floorboard. It contained alternating entries, one in tight, crooked handwriting, one in elegant script. Gideon and Clara had been logging their crimes, dates, names, suggestions, critiques.
like business partners refining a trade. The defense had little hope. They argued that the cousins were products of extreme isolation, that their minds had warped without social contact. But the evidence was undeniable. They planned, they coordinated, they executed. When Gideon was asked if he had killed Reverend Marsh, he looked up and said simply, "Yes." No remorse, no rage, just a fact. Clara said only one thing during the entire trial. When shown a diary of a woman they had murdered, she whispered, "The mountains were hungry. We fed them." On August 23, 1857, they were hanged side by side in the town square. Their final words were spoken to each other. Clara, "The mountains will remember." Gideon, "And they won't forgive." Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the edge of the cemetery. Their homes were burned to the ground, but the legend remained. People who visited the old trails reported strange feelings. Dogs refused to walk certain paths. New owners abandoned Clara's land within months. The cave was dynamited shut, the cellars filled with stone and soil, but the story never really left. In the decades that followed, the town chose silence. There are no clocks, no roadside signs, just mountains and memories. After the execution of Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn, the town of Cedar Hollow did what many communities do after a public trauma. They buried it. Not just the bodies, but the entire story. Their cabins were burned, the cave collapsed with dynamite, and the cellar beneath Clara's barn filled with stone and soil. But, as anyone from the mountains will tell you, covering something doesn't mean it's gone. In the months after the hanging, things didn't go back to normal. The trails around Black Hollow Ridge were avoided entirely. Hunters changed their routes. Children were told to stay close. The Hutchkins family moved west. Locals swore that animals no longer crossed the old paths between the cousins' homes. Dogs barked into the trees at nothing. Horses grew skittish passing certain bends in the road. The land itself seemed uneasy. Then came the whispers. People claimed they heard voices near the old cellar, soft, urgent, like someone calling for help. A group of boys dared each other to visit the ridge at dusk and return pale, one of them crying, saying they saw Clara standing at the edge of the woods, her face hidden beneath black hair, unmoving. The town's preacher tried to hold a service to cleanse the land. Only 6 people came. When he returned to the site alone days later, he found a small wooden figure nailed to a tree, crudely carved with a rope around its neck. He never visited again. Even in daylight, a heaviness seemed to hang over that patch of forest. It was like sound itself hesitated to move there. The sheriff resigned the following spring and moved to Missouri without saying goodbye. His wife would later write in a letter, she wouldn't sleep with the windows open, said the wind spoke in voices he couldn't ignore. By winter, a strange silence took hold. People no longer spoke the cousins' names. The area was simply the dead stretch. It was unspoken, but understood. No one built there. No one walked there. And if you had to pass near it, you didn't stop. You didn't look. You certainly didn't speak. But the fear didn't end with superstition. A string of miscarriages struck families living near the ridge. Crops failed more than usual. Some blamed the soil. Others didn't offer explanations at all. Just looks, just silence. A local midwife stopped attending births near that side of the valley. Nothing grows where too much has bled, she once said. Folklore began to take root. Some said Gideon and Clara had made a pact, that their quiet demeanor wasn't apathy, but a belief that their work would continue after death, that the mountains had accepted their offering, and were it yet done. Others believed their crimes were merely the beginning of something deeper, that the pair had uncovered or awakened something older than themselves. A school teacher, new to the region, tried to collect oral histories in the 1870s. Every interview ended the same way, with the subject falling quiet at the mention of the cousins. One woman offered this before shutting her door. The bodies are gone, but what they opened, that's still here. Cedar Hollow didn't erase Gideon and Clara. It absorbed them into silence, superstition, and the places maps won't name.
In 1884, nearly 3 decades after Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn were hanged, a land surveyor named Everett Cole was hired to map the abandoned plots near Black Hollow Ridge. The area had grown wild again, trees choking trails, moss swallowing stone foundations. Locals still avoided the place, but Cole wasn't from the region. He wasn't raised with the stories. While marking boundaries near what had once been Clara's property, Cole stepped through soft earth and dropped through a rotted floorboard into the ruins of the cellar. The air was damp, the floor muddy. His lantern flickered. Most men would have climbed out. Cole stayed. He found what others had missed. Wedged behind a collapsed wall beam, sealed in wax and wrapped in burlap, a rusted tin box. Inside was a stack of papers, stained and brittle, written in tight, precise handwriting. It was a second journal. Unlike the first, used in the trial and attributed to both Gideon and Clara, this one was older, and it wasn't in either of their hands. The entries were dated between 1848 and 1853, years before the cousins began their crimes. The writer never identified himself by name, but the voice was clinical, cold. The contents weren't confessions, they were instructions. Each entry was like a lesson plan: how to psychologically condition a subject, how to test emotional detachment, how to lure travelers without suspicion. There were references to inheritance by behavior, the promise of bloodline, and multiple mentions of 2 figures only identified as the girl and the boy. Chillingly, one line read, "She learns quickly, he even faster. They are bound by more than blood." The implication was immediate and horrifying. Gideon and Clara hadn't just acted on impulse. They had been groomed, trained. Cole turned the box over to county officials. It caused a quiet stir, never publicized, but whispered about in courthouse halls. Then, inexplicably, the journal disappeared. No record, no archive entry, just gone. But local historian Marla Hensley, who uncovered the story decades later, found scattered evidence of its existence. Letters between county clerks referencing the Black Hollow materials, and one particularly disturbing note from a councilman in 1885 that read, "Destroy it if you must, but if the mountain chose them once, it will choose again. Let's not tempt it." Rumors exploded. Some claimed the journal was destroyed deliberately, out of fear that the methods inside might inspire copycats. Others believed it was hidden away, kept in private hands by those who knew its value or feared its power. A few even theorized that the unnamed author of the journal had been a recluse from deeper in the mountains, perhaps someone connected to Clara or Gideon's family, an uncle, a mentor, a cultist. Theories piled high, but no answers came. What the journal suggested was a shift in the story's core. It was no longer just about 2 cousins lost to madness or darkness. It hinted at something organized, calculated, a lineage of violence passed down like a legacy. Some investigators revisited the idea of others being involved, perhaps a network or even a philosophy that stretched beyond Black Hollow Ridge. The term Appalachian doctrine began to appear in fringe literature, suggesting that what happened wasn't isolated, but systemic. Even the dates offered a disturbing context. The training journal ended in 1853. Gideon and Clara's crimes began in 1856. That left 3 years unaccounted for. What happened in that time? Who finalized the transformation? And what became of the journal's author? Marla Hensley published her findings in a limited academic paper that was quietly rejected by every historical journal she submitted it to. One editor allegedly told her, "We don't need more myths, we need less." She stopped writing soon after.
To this day, no one has confirmed the journal's location. Some say it's hidden in a private collection in Louisville. Others believe it's buried, perhaps even in the mountains themselves, returned to the soil that birthed its darkness. But the bigger question remains, what if Gideon and Clara weren't alone? What if they were never the beginning, but part of a tradition? Deputy Mark Trust was 24 years old when he helped arrest Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn. He was young, but already well-respected, a sharpshooter, steady under pressure, and one of Sheriff Decker's most trusted men. He was the one who kicked in Clara's door. He stood in that dim cabin while she poured tea for a man she planned to kill. He watched Gideon step from the shadows and saw, firsthand, the moment the cousins were caught. He later said Clara didn't flinch, didn't panic. She simply looked at him, as if she had expected him, not as an interruption, but as a final guest. That look stayed with Truss. 2 years later, in 1859, Mark Truss resigned. No scandal, no illness, just a handwritten letter that read, "Some places stain you, even if you think you walked out clean." He disappeared from town records after that. No one knew where he went. Some believed he moved north. Others whispered he stayed in the mountains, a drifter haunted by what he saw. Then in 1901, more than 40 years later, an old man arrived in Cedar Hollow. He walked with a limp, wore a long coat, and introduced himself simply as Mark. He asked for directions to Black Hollow Ridge. At first, no one recognized him, but when he passed the general store, a woman named Eliza Decker, granddaughter of the late sheriff, froze. She remembered him from a faded photograph, the jawline, the eyes. It was Mark Truss. When asked why he'd come back so long, he replied, "There's something I forgot to bury." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. A week later, his rented room above the tavern was found empty, the bed untouched, his belongings still there, except his canteen, boots, and knife. The town organized a search party. They found no body, no sign of a struggle. But near the overgrown remains of Gideon's cabin, they did find the knife, half buried in dirt, initials MT still etched in the handle. A few yards away, nailed to a tree with a rusted railroad spike, was a single sheet of paper. It was stained, likely from moisture, but the words were still legible. "I thought I could forget, but I hear them again. She hums. He walks behind me. The mountain remembers, and now I do too." The tree it was nailed to, it withered by spring, stood bare until it fell in a windless night 2 years later. Locals whispered that Truss had gone mad, that memories had driven him into the woods to die. Others said he found something he couldn't carry back. But then came the odd part. In 1922, a farmer clearing brush near the same ridge discovered a small, leather-bound notebook buried under stacked stones. Inside were dated entries, each one signed MT. The entries were erratic, filled with hallucinations, paranoia, and guilt. One read, "I was wrong. It wasn't just them. There's another place. Deeper. Older." She said the map was never finished. Another, the cellar under Clara's house was only one gate. There were more. It hinted that the cellar the deputies had uncovered was just part of a larger system, that Gideon and Clara may have had access to hidden trails, hidden rooms, perhaps even hidden allies. The notebook vanished soon after. It was turned over to a local pastor for safekeeping, but when a historian asked to see it a year later, the pastor claimed he had no memory of it. Today, the story of Deputy Truss is considered a ghost tale by many, but those who study the case seriously see something more. A man who carried his guilt for decades, only to realize that guilt might have been a sign, not of what he failed to stop, but of what he never understood. And if Truss was right, if there were more gates, more places like Clara's cellar, then what he found in those final days may have gone far beyond anything the sheriff or the court ever imagined.
In the Appalachian Mountains, silence isn't just a tradition, it's a survival skill. Long before radios or roads connected remote communities, People learn that what you don't say can protect you. Words travel. So do curses. After Gideon Voss and Clara Wynn were executed, that silence hardened into something more than caution. It became a kind of cultural armor. The story was too disturbing, too raw, and unlike folklore or ghost tales, this one was undeniably real. People had seen the chains, smelled the cellar, knew the names in the journals, so they stopped speaking. Families in Cedar Hollow tore pages from Bibles that mentioned the cousins. Property records were doctored or lost. Schools never taught what had happened in 1857, even though the hanging was the largest public execution the region had ever seen. The ridge was left unnamed on new maps. One old-timer simply said, "You don't mark rot." Generations passed down warnings with no explanations. A mother might whisper to her child, "Don't play near the hollow," but never explain why. A man might avoid a stretch of forest, but change the subject if asked. Silence was a shield, and also a sentence. In that silence, myths took root. Anything strange or sinister became the cousins. A baby born with a veil over its face, the cousins. A crop blighted overnight, the cousins. A stranger seen walking uphill at dusk with no lantern, the cousins. The story became both scapegoat and shadow, but not everyone accepted the silence. In 1928, a folklorist named Ezra Bell traveled to eastern Kentucky hoping to document forgotten tales of mountain life. His notes were clear. Something was being hidden. Villagers went quiet when he asked about Black Hollow Ridge. Doors closed. Conversations shifted. He called it the weight behind their eyes. Despite this, Bell compiled enough material for a book, Appalachian Morning. Buried in the final chapter was a section called The Black Hollow Pact. It described chilling details, rumors of a second journal, a grandmother who claimed Clara once tried to draw symbols in her stew, and a former pastor who said Gideon visited him just weeks before the arrest, asking strange questions about the book of Leviticus. The book was pulled from shelves within 6 months. Bell disappeared from the public eye. The cultural silence persisted into the 20th century. Historians who probed too deep were dismissed. Locals called them stirrers, a regional term for people who couldn't leave things buried. One such historian, Dr. Henry Maddox, tried to host a public lecture in the 1970s. No one came. Flyers were torn down. He later wrote, "The holler doesn't need chains anymore. It has memory and fear." Today, that silence still lingers, but it has cracks. Younger Appalachians have started asking questions. Podcasts, YouTube videos, and amateur documentaries have reignited interest. People are visiting Cedar Hollow. Some descend from the families who once watched Clara walk by with a pale stare and bare feet. But not everyone welcomes the attention. At a town meeting in 2016, a local councilwoman reportedly said, "Let sleeping things lie. If the mountain buried it, we don't need to dig it up." Still, the story endures, not just in shadows, but in behavior. Locals still won't name the ridge, hunters won't camp near it, and every now and then, someone swears they hear humming on the wind. Gideon and Clara may be gone, but their story did something more permanent than haunt. It reshaped how a region speaks, or doesn't. In the end, the silence isn't just about fear, it's about memory. And memory in the mountains runs deep. Quiet, yes, but never empty. Today, the land where Clara Wynn and Gideon Voss once lived remains largely untouched. On satellite maps, it's just a patch of green. No trails, no buildings, no signs. Technically, it's public land, but no one hikes there. No one camps. Even the Forest Service avoids it when they can. Locals say GPS doesn't work right near Black Hollow Ridge. Compasses spin. Phones die for no reason.
If this chilling story from America's forgotten corners stirred something in you, Subscribe to the channel for more long-form deep dives into history's darkest shadows. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from and if you've heard of other unsettling stories lost to time.